Four teams can reasonably win the Pac-12, and it seems like it is way up in the air. So, what are the paths to a Pac-12 title for Utah, USC, Oregon, and UCLA? Let's go.
Are Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster. Thank you for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. If you're watching on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Conference of Champions. Like, comment, subscribe, please, if you haven't already, wherever you're listening to or watching this show. I appreciate every single one of you out there who has done so already, and I appreciate Carter Bahns as well, senior writer and editor at beaverblitz.com, for coming back on the show to help break down and go through all these potential scenarios. Who controls their own destiny? Who doesn't? What are the tie-breaking rules? There's a lot to get to today, so I wasn't going to try and tackle it on my own. Carter, good to talk to you, man.
My head is already spinning from the 30 to 45 minutes we spent before we hit the record button to try to figure out all of this just garbage language listed on the Pac-12 website to determine ties. So yeah, that's a little behind the scenes for anybody listening right now. Like, we have been hard at work for, the better part of an hour trying to just even learn. Basically, we're relearning how to read. Actually,
we're learning all sorts of words and how you can write the most complicated language possible in some instances. So there are four teams that can reasonably win the Pac-12 championship. USC and Utah are still very much in it. They need a little bit of help, and then Oregon and UCLA control their own destinies to get to the Pac-12 championship game. Though I'll say that is by the book how it is. I can't foresee a scenario where 8-1 doesn't get you in. We could have multiple teams at 8-1, which we will get to later. But let's start with USC. They can't lose, in all likelihood, another Pac-12 game. And is it technically possible a two-loss team could get in? Yes, Oregon State and Washington fans, it is technically possible. However, with the way these teams are playing, it really feels like you're going to have one-loss teams and the schedules that they've got. And I really think that you're going to get two 8-1 teams out of this group of four with the way they're playing, barring major injuries or a dramatic drop-off in their competitive style of play for the last few weeks, especially since conference play has begun. It's what it looks like. So let's start with USC. They've got to win out. That would give them a head-to-head with UCLA. And then the help they would need is they would need Utah to lose another Pac-12 game to ensure they could get one of those slots, because the Utes have the head-to-head tiebreaker at the moment. And then they also would need Oregon to not be undefeated. And I don't think anyone can go undefeated. It hasn't happened yet. Oregon and UCLA are the only teams with a chance right now, but they've still got a lot of tough games, especially Oregon probably has the toughest schedule of the group remaining at this point in the season, which we'll get to. But the path for USC to get to this Pac-12 championship game, Carter, it's really not that unreasonable, because their schedule, Arizona, Cal, Colorado, UCLA, and Notre Dame. Notre Dame stinks. That's a bad football team, straight up. UCLA is a losable game, but I look at all the other ones and I say, boy, I kind of see the Trojans at 11-1, 10-2 with just one Pac-12 loss at the worst.
I'll say too, you mentioned it's really difficult to go undefeated in Pac-12 play. Well, there's two undefeated teams right now, and they're playing each other next weekend. So you're only going to have one left after next week too, which this weekend technically. That's right. And I know we're talking USC here. So, if USC gets that tiebreaker over UCLA at the end of the season, that's going to be big for the Trojans, just because, anytime we talk about USC or Oregon in ties here, things get really training each other this year. So USC is really hoping that it ends up in a tie against UCLA with a head-to-head victory, because obviously the Trojans now have a head-to-head loss against Utah, which will give Utah, the tiebreaker there. You have no idea how the tiebreaker is going to. There is no head-to-head. And so you're only, the only opportunity you have left for a head-to-head like advantage is against UCLA. So anything that involves a tie with the Trojans and Ducks, it doesn't look particularly like set in stone. Like, oh, like USC is really, set. And it does feel like USC really does need to, if not win out, only lose to a team that's not going to be involved in a tiebreaker.
Yeah, but if they do win out, I don't see how they wouldn't be in. They'd be 11-1, 8-1 in conference play. Most importantly, and remember, no style points here either. You don't have to impress a committee, right? This is not college football playoff talk. This is just conference championship. Only thing that matters at this point in time are wins and losses. And I think USC's path there is pretty reasonable because they've already played most of their tough games. Carter, Washington State can trip you up. They got by them. They didn't play their best game against Arizona State, but they ultimately won by 17. They escaped Corvallis with a win. Yeah, they lose to Utah here, but I just look at those 5 remaining games and say they're going to be double-digit favorites in 4 of them. They may very well be favored against UCLA as well because they could be on a 3-game winning streak going into it, and the offense would have the chance to really have things rolling there. Let's go to the team they just lost to over the weekend in one of the most awesome environments and football games of the weekend, which was jam-packed full of them in this beautiful sport we call college football. Utah probably would also have to win out, but as I said on Monday's show, conference championship, Rose Bowl, that's all still in play for the Utes. I think the biggest thing they've got to have is a head-to-head win against Oregon, but they are probably rooting for Oregon to beat UCLA this Saturday because if you're Utah, you're saying, well, we got to win out, but we also need the team we lost to, UCLA, to take a couple L's.
Exactly. Utah wants this thing to get as messy as possible, particularly because it does already hold one tiebreaker head-to-head. It has a chance to get another one against Oregon. I feel like this last game, on Saturday against USC was essentially a must-win for Utah if it was going to get back to the Pac-12 title.
100%.
And from here on out, I mean, all of these games pretty much are must-wins for USC and Utah. But a huge win for the Utes because leave that weekend at 3-2. We're talking about all the 2-loss teams in the conference right now essentially being out of the mix. It would very well have been a 3-team race had USC held on to win that game against Utah. So it does feel like both of those teams need to win out. And if that's I think we're going to be looking at Utah having probably the advantage of getting into the conference title, because if it does win out, it's going to have a bunch of tiebreakers against these other teams in the mix.
And their schedule, they are off this week, but then next, I believe it's Thursday. It's either Thursday or Friday. They go at Pullman. Could be a major, major trap game because that's not an easy place to play. And Washington State is not playing great football offensively, but their defense is pretty darn good. And at home, that could be tricky. But then they've got Arizona and Stanford. Those will be wins. Big game at Oregon. And then they have Colorado. So I don't think that's an unreasonable path either. Like that's what's so fun about this right now, Carter, in the Pac-12. There are 4 teams right now that can win, as we've been talking about, and it's not like, well, this team's more likely than that one, and it's 4 in the mix, but it's really these 2. Like there is a legitimate path with completely realistic outcomes for all 4 of these teams. We'll get to the other 2 that control their own destiny in UCLA and Oregon after reminding you that from cringing at the pump to getting an eye-popping check, your favorite restaurant, inflation is hitting us all where it hurts, and it really hurts. That's why I started using Upside, an incredible app for anyone who buys gas, groceries, or dines out. Any of that apply to you? You want to get Upside. I'm earning cash back thanks to Upside. To get started, download the free Upside app, use my promo code LOCKED, and get $5 more cash back on your first purchase of $10 or more. Upside users are earning more than $1 million every week. That's probably why Upside has a 4.8 star rating on the App Store. Download the free Upside app. Use promo code LOCKED to get $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 or more. It's that easy. Download the free Upside app. $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 or more using promo code LOCKED. So, Carter, let's go to the teams that do control their own destiny, right? You see, your Utah and USC need a little bit of help, but I mean, it's just a smidgen of help to get themselves back into the mix, and it's just not that unrealistic that they will receive at least some of it, if not all that they would need to get to Las Vegas in December in the Pac-12 Championship game. But let's move over to Oregon, and they can lose a game, so can UCLA, but one of them is going to suddenly be operating on thin ice after this Saturday. But they can lose a game, and then going into the end of the season, if they're going to be one of the two teams at the top of the conference, they'll have to beat either UCLA or Utah. Do you think it matters which one that is? Is there a matchup there that's more favorable? Because I think it's just kind of, you got to just get one. And obviously, you have to hold serve against Oregon State and Washington, and those are far from cupcakes. Oregon's easily got the toughest remaining schedule here, but between UCLA and Utah is, I guess a win against UCLA doesn't knock them out of the picture. A win against Utah does, because it'd be their second loss. That's the only reason I could really differentiate those two opponents for the Ducks.
I think that the win against Utah is more important because it does narrow it down to a 3-team race. And you look at the remaining schedules, and UCLA has a game against USC coming up, and you say, okay, well, that's a chance for a loss there too. So, beating UCLA, obviously that gives the Bruins a loss. They could still lose to USC, but I think the fact that you narrow it down to 3 with a win over Utah, I think that puts the Ducks in a better situation. I do want to. I was thinking about this during the ad break, and I want to on seasons and standings like this midway through, where you've got 3 teams from what would have been the South in contention and one from the North, is exactly why the Pac-12 stripped the divisional model.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
in any other year, we'd be looking at this and saying, man, Oregon State still has a great chance to get into the Pac-12 title as a 2-loss team. Or, Washington, if it beats Oregon, it's got a great path. But here we are talking about, Oregon could miss the Pac-12 title altogether, and you could have, what would be your far and away your best, in any other year, it would get in automatically. You could have that team miss it because there's 3 teams in the South that are better than it this year. So look, it's complicated. It's a mess, but at the end of the day, it is for the best, because we are going to get the 2 best teams in the conference in the championship game. Whereas if you could have a 1-loss USC team get out and a 2 or 3-loss Oregon State team get in.
Yeah, and I came on this show kind of around the time I started hosting it in the spring, and when that rule change was announced, I said, yeah, this is a great idea. And there have been 11 Pac-12 championship games. Carter, 5 of them would have been different matchups had this rule been implemented, and you wouldn't have had to see, though USC was on probation in 2011, a 6-6 UCLA team go play Oregon. That's not the best product you could have put on the field that year. A rematch with Stanford and Oregon would have been a lot more fun. There are countless other examples where it would have been advantageous for the conference. But bringing it back to Oregon here, they've got UCLA, Cal, and Colorado. Those should be wins. I know Colorado got the big win in Boulder, but neither football team is very good. I've not been high on them coming into this year. As the season has gone on, I'm happy for Colorado, and I'm happy it came against Cal, because then it didn't, majorly derail someone else's season on a fluky play or anything like that. It's like Cal's just not, they're not that good. I think people sort of see that now, though. An intriguing selection for the Pac-12 Prime Picks this week. Story for another day. They've got Cal, Colorado after UCLA. Then they've got Washington, Utah, and the Bees. That's a gauntlet, because we have to preface all of this by saying we are assuming no upsets, and these are possible, realistic scenarios. But you look at these teams and the schedules they've got remaining, Oregon is the most primed to lose a game to a team that is not among what we'll call the big four here that are contending for the championship in USC, Utah, UCLA. They don't play the Trojans, but they play the Utes, they play UCLA, they've got the Beavs and Washington still remaining. I think it's by far the toughest schedule left.
And this is an important point, too, where we say, obviously, racking up wins for all of these teams is very important to stay alive in the race. But I think it's particularly important for Oregon because the Ducks do not play the Trojans. When you get down to when you go through the tiebreaker ladder, there are so many scenarios in the tiebreaker system that involve your record against other teams throughout the conference. And so if Oregon ends up in a tie with USC at the end of the year, the Ducks better hope that they have great records against opponents. And so that's why these wins are so important. That's the thing with these tiebreakers is like, yes, your head-to-head matters, but the entire body of work throughout your entire season really is taken into account in a lot of the tiebreaker scenarios. So it's that this really applies to right now are Oregon and USC, because USC plays UCLA and Utah, Oregon plays UCLA and Utah. But the fact that these two teams don't play each other, every single win means just a little bit more in the scenario that those two teams are tied for the second spot.
Let's go to the last team now, UCLA, and their path to the Pac-12 Championship Game. They do not have to win out. They can have a loss in there. Their schedule also sets up pretty favorably because they've got to play more road games. 5 of their 6 so far this year have been at home, but you look at these games and they go at Oregon. That's certainly the toughest road game they have. Stanford, Arizona State, Arizona, USC, and then Cal. Bruins are going to be favored in all but probably 2 of those games, but if they can just find a way to win one between USC and Oregon, I don't think it really matters to the Bruins which of those teams it is. If they are able to avoid upsets against all the other teams, their path to the Pac-12 Championship Game is pretty clear.
I think it's the best path of any team right now, just because, like you said, they do still play Oregon and USC. And you might look at that and say, wow, they have a really tough schedule the rest of the way. Well, I look at it and say they have a chance to pick against both of those teams, or at least one of them. And I think as long as you have one tie-breaking win, you have to feel pretty good about your chances of getting in, just because, the head-to-head means so much because it is the first tie-breaking factor. After that, it really all bets are off. But I think it's important to have one tie-breaking win against all of these teams. And UCLA already has one against Utah. So you pick up another one against Oregon or USC, and like your odds of getting screwed out of the title game are so low at that point because you have tiebreakers against 2 of the 3 teams you're competing against.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's, again, barring an upset where they stumble to somebody else. You never know who that could be. That's why they play the games, folks. And this week's thrilling moment brought to you by Nissan, which have worked with us here at the Locked On Network to create thrilling moments where we highlight the most exciting play from the Pac-12 weekend slate. And I tell you what, Carter, pretty easy selection here. The Cam Rising 2-point conversion run. Kyle Whittingham, absolute stones as a head coach, saying, yeah, we're going. Trust his quarterback, who goes out there, makes a play. Not a design quarterback run the way one of his touchdown rushes was. I believe the touchdown that became the go-ahead one there late in the game on the quarterback power play that was really well designed and well executed. But looks back, or drops back, looks, sees no one, takes off, fights his way in for a 43-42 victory. That is your thrilling moment. This segment has been inspired by the thrilling new designs featured across Nissan's new lineup of vehicles. Pursue what thrills you in the all-new Frontier, Armada, or Pathfinder today, available now at nissanusa.com. So let's get to the tiebreaker scenarios real quick, Carter. And someone asked an interesting question. If you ever want a question answered here on the show, by all means, YouTube comments at Smalls_55 or at LO_Pac-12, the Twitter handles. Slide right up into the DMs, or just come in the Twitter mentions as this USC fan did. And I have to give a shout out to his name on there. Get over it, salty Sooners. That's
Oh,
pretty
that's
good. That's
awesome.
pretty good. That's pretty good. I don't think they're over it yet, especially since Brent Venables can't stop a nosebleed over there in Norman lately. But he says, I'm unfamiliar with the tie-breaking scenarios. If UCLA, Oregon, and USC all finish 8-1 in the Pac-12, who goes to Vegas? This scenario would mean UCLA beats Oregon, and then Oregon wins out and beats Utah, and USC beats UCLA. So this is what all our preparation, all our work has come down to this very moment, Carter. And this is a tricky question. We're going to try to lay things out as clearly and as concisely as we can. And the reason this gets complicated, like you alluded to, is that in this hypothetical where UCLA, USC, and Oregon are 8-1, is you don't have a head-to-head between Oregon and USC. But the way I have interpreted the rules, correct me if I am wrong here, is this would be the LA schools going to the Pac-12 championship game.
Yeah, run through that scenario one more time just so that we're
Yep.
on the same page here.
So 3 teams at 8-1. There are 4 scenarios where you have 3 8-1 Pac-12 teams. This one would be UCLA, Oregon, and USC all at 8-1. UCLA beats Oregon. So the Bruins have the head-to-head over the Ducks. Oregon beats Utah. Utes are out of it with 2 conference losses. And then USC beats UCLA, so they have the head-to-head with the Bruins. If you have those 3 sitting there at 8-1, you would then look at the next highest ranked, or you'd look at common opponents between USC and Oregon, and the Trojans should have that tiebreaker advantage because in this hypothetical, they would have beaten UCLA, who Oregon would have then lost to, and then UCLA is already ahead of Oregon because they have the head-to-head.
That's correct. And the head-to-head between UCLA and Oregon is important there because it turns it from, or it takes it from a multiple team tie to a 2-team tie. If you look at the Pac-12 website, there are two different types of tiebreakers. You've got the 2-team and the multiple team. And the goal in all of these things is to get multiple team tiebreakers and turn them into 2-team ties.
Right.
So the head-to-head that UCLA win turns this into a 2-team tie between Oregon and USC. And then with the whole common opponent thing, USC would get the nod over Oregon in that scenario.
That is our interpretation. Thank you for the question, and we hope that is correct because we spent a lot of time going through and just trying to figure all this out. But that's not the most, or not the least likely scenario because there are a lot that could play out. The other situations where you could have 3 teams at 8-1 is if the one that he asked about was Oregon, UCLA, and USC, which would be the Bruins beating the Ducks beat the Utes, and USC beats UCLA. You could also have UCLA, Utah, USC, all Pac-12 South teams tied at 8-1. UCLA would beat Oregon. Utah would beat Oregon. 2 losses, the Ducks are gone. USC beats UCLA, and that's their 1 conference loss. The other 2, I'll explain these and then we'll kind of move on from it, but just so you all know the madness that could ensue in the coming weeks in the Pac-12, you could have Utah, USC, Oregon, where the Ducks beat the Bruins, the Trojans beat UCLA to give them 2 losses, but Utah beats Oregon, wins out, and has just 1 loss. And the other possibility is Oregon, UCLA, and Utah, where Oregon wins this Saturday. The Utes beat the Ducks, and UCLA beats USC to give the Trojans their 2nd loss. All of them are possible. What else is possible? UCLA or Oregon becomes the first team to run the table in conference play and go 9-0, or everyone gets to 2 losses, or you have just 2 teams at 8-1. There are a lot of different ways that this could play out, Carter, and it's fascinating. I can't remember a time where it's been this stacked and where you could realistically see all of these potential scenarios playing out.
It's so messy just because of the fact that we don't have divisions anymore. But I'm glad you lay out all of those possible.
But it's glorious.
No, it is. No, it's awesome because it means that you're going to have I guess, one team will say like, oh, we got screwed in this thing, but like the tiebreaker set up for a reason. Like the two best teams by resume will end up in the title game. Like it's guaranteed. But I'm glad that you run through all the scenarios because I want to highlight the one that gets the absolute messiest is Oregon, USC, Utah.
Mm-hmm.
You have all of these like, Oregon would have beaten Utah, but Utah would have beaten USC. Well, Oregon doesn't play USC, so then we have to go to common opponents, and then UCLA is not even in this scenario. But what the teams did against UCLA matters a ton because that's going to be UCLA in that situation would be the next best common opponent, and so
Right.
you start there and work your way down.
But in that hypothetical, Oregon and USC would have both beaten UCLA.
Right.
So then it would go to the next highest ranked team. Would that be Washington? Would that be maybe Oregon State? And if they both win that, and then it would keep going down.
Yeah.
So if you have three teams at the end of the year that are 8-1, then absolute chaos can ensue, but it gets even nuttier when you put Oregon and USC in there because they don't have that head-to-head. So there's no direct, easy way to figure out which team garners the higher seed.
This is the fun thing. If Oregon and USC are tied, we could get to a scenario where what Oregon and USC did against like the 2 or 3 worst teams in the conference will decide. Like we could be looking at okay, well, Oregon, beat Stanford, but and USC also did, and so then we have to move on to what they did against, probably Colorado, who I think we can assume is probably going to finish this thing at the bottom of the standings. I mean, we could be top of the conference head to head against the absolute bottom as the determinant, which is what kind of tripped Spencer and I up as we were doing our preparation. It's just the fact that you have this scenario where you're comparing teams' common opponents and the exact same record against those opponents. Then you go to the number of total wins they have. Then you bring in this outside analytical company and you compare their power ratings.
And then
you
all the
flip a
way at the
coin.
bottom, if everything, which is probably 1 in a million, doesn't work out, they'll flip a coin.
Which, for like I really hope it comes down to a coin flip just to prove how stupid all of this really is, and to make the Pac-12 reword some of its just archaic language.
Just to make us feel vindicated in our frustration trying to interpret all of the language and such. However, I think we both understand, Carter, it is unlikely it will come to any of this because it's certainly not impossible, but I think the most likely scenario is you have two teams at 8-1 and two teams with 2 conference losses. I could see USC losing to UCLA, which I thought before the year. I kind of still think that. And then Utah could lose to Oregon, or Utah could win out and Oregon could stumble against Washington or Oregon State.
An upset for one or
UCLA.
two of these teams, it really does make things a lot easier because
Yes.
Then you're looking at like 1 or 2 1-win teams and not, or 1-loss teams, sorry, and not 4 of them. I just really hope that Oregon and USC don't end up in a tie, because then you're going to have fans saying like, oh, this tiebreaker system is broken. Like we got screwed out of a Pac-12 title appearance because we played this team and USC didn't. Like, I don't want it to get messy like that, because that's not how it should be determined. Like it should just be determined by head to head. And it's unfortunate that, not every team in this conference plays. Makes it a little more fun, but it does mean that there is the possibility for one team to kind of feel like it got slighted by the process.
Yeah, but we'll have to just wait and see how that process plays out. We're going to end it there on the show today. Washington and Oregon State did notable things over the weekend that are worthy of discussion. You'll have to tune into tomorrow's show to hear all of that, Carter. Usually I've got time to ask you about the Beavs, but all this stuff just so fascinating to to dissect. If you've got 15-second thoughts, by all means, shout them out.
I mean, I'll just leave it with this. Do you think I think we've used the phrase win and tie and thrown all of these team
Scenario.
names out here so many
I've said
different times.
scenario and scenario like 5 different
Right.
ways on this show.
Exactly. So I feel like, I'm going to apologize for the listeners, right? To the listeners right now. I'm sorry. But I mean, that's the way
Well,
this
if you've
process
got
lines
any
up right now.
it's just the way it is at the moment. If you've got any questions or anything is not clear, send them in. Again, smalls_55 or at LO_Pac-12. Come in the mentions, direct messages, whatever's better. Hop in the YouTube comments as well. Ask a question if something's not clear, and I can go over it again tomorrow on the show, because we want you all to be informed and understanding just how much fun the next 6 weeks of football could be in the Pac-12. Cannot wait. Appreciate everyone listening. See you all next time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.